Good morning. It's Reverend Mike Capron. Our Bible text for today is from Mark 15:22 to 32. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him there. Dividing his clothes, they cast lots or rolled dice to see what each would get. It was 9 in the morning when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, you are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days. Come down from the cross and save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross so that we may see and believe." Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. This ends our reading. This is the first sermon in a series that I'm going to base in part on the book Churches and the Crisis of Decline. And it's by Dr. Andrew Root. He is a friend of a friend, and I've been on a couple of Zoom calls with him. He's a faithful Christian with a gift for writing. And what I really admire about him is the way he uses narrative or story and mixes it with theology to make his points. In this book, his narrative revolves around a composite church. Andrew does a lot of work with a lot of churches. He's taken pieces of what he's seen in many churches and melded them together in this somewhat hypothetical but very realistic church, St. John the Baptist. His story starts in an actual space, the Church Brew Works in Pittsburgh. It's a former church that was converted to a microbrewery. And this is how Root begins his narrative, sitting in the place eating his dinner. "It was a haunted space. If I paused and blocked out all the ambient noise, I could hear it. The faint echoes of life and worship, a century of suffering and joy. It all dripped from the walls. You could feel it if you let yourself. It reverberated ever so softly but assuredly with all those decades of prayers, sermons, funerals, and overall yearning for God's action. But I'll admit, it was hard to stay haunted when the wings and the riblets were so amazing." He then spends the rest of the chapter discussing the demise of this hypothetical composite church. In order to follow his discussion, you should remember 2 terms that I've used with my congregation to speak about a church. Vitality describes a church's ability to accomplish its mission with vigor. My congregation, the First Presbyterian Church of Elmwood Park, is vital. Our worship and education offerings are rich. We are generous in our financial support of mission, and when an opportunity for hands-on service arises that is within our capability, we jump in with gusto. We are also partnered with the 3 other churches that share our building. The other term is viability. Vitality, viability now is the second. A viable church is one that has sufficient resources, financial and human, to maintain its current level of programming, staffing, and building maintenance without depleting its financial resources or spiritual energy of the leadership. It is looking like First Presbyterian Church of Elmwood Park may not be viable in the long term. Our finances are strong and our building is in good shape, but our people resources are dwindling. The congregation has been hearing about this at various points for over a year now. We had a series of discussion questions in Lent. The session, that's the leadership of our church, and I are working on developing our options enough that we can come to the congregation for an intentional time of prayer and discernment in the fall. There are basically 2 choices: leave here and go join with another church, or stay here as long as we can keep this up. Once the session's current research is complete, we will come back so the entire congregation can participate in a season of prayer, discernment, and discussion about what God is calling us to do. And I am hopeful that as a whole church, we'll make a decision by the end of the year. Not implement the decision, but pick a direction. So stay tuned. We'll keep you posted. All right. Now back to our hypothetical composite church, St. John the Baptist from the book. Andrew, or Andy as his friends call him, spends most of chapter 1 talking about how the church closes. I'm going to quote a lot of what he says verbatim because it sets the stage for the rest of the book. And all the ingredients he uses in this fictional church incorporate a lot of things that real-world churches have tried. So maybe chapter 1 is a bit of a downer, but let me promise that it gets better. Starting in chapter 2, he proposes an alternate history wherein St. John the Baptist regains its vitality. It may never regain its viability, but it does regain its vitality. And that's a good thing, because these two qualities reflect two different kinds of death. You have all known people who've lived a rich, vibrant, happy, spiritual life while their physical strength and health was declining. As people, they had vitality, but not viability. You have also known sour, dull, inward-focused people who drive friends and family away. Regardless of how much viability they have lost their vitality. The St. John the Baptist Church in chapter 1 has lost both. And here is how Andy tells that story. The congregation was formed in 1912 and erected the building in 1920. The same young men who worked in the mills and factories just north of the city and then gave their youth fighting in the trenches of France built most of the sanctuary with their hands. When the stained glass was installed after World War II, it became the talk of the surrounding churches. The beautiful stained glass became a space inside a space, a symbolic representation of life and death. Each boy who died in the bright blue waters of the Pacific or in the menacing cold waters of Normandy was placed into the biblical stories depicted in the glass. This connected their story of lost life with God's own lost life in Jesus. The lost boys were given an ever-present space in the life of the community that had lost them and lived on without them. It was boys who fought and died, but it was the women who lived without them who gave them a place in the glass. As the factories in the neighborhood were shifted to producing arms for the war, the women who worked in their husband's absence picked up extra hours to fund the production of the stained glass. After the Second World War, the congregation ballooned in size from about 100 members to over 200. With the growth came a new education wing and an expansion to the sanctuary. The neighborhood began to change in the latter part of the 20th century. African American families joined European immigrant families. The congregation reflected this change, although not quite on par with the demographics of the neighborhood as a whole. Nevertheless, this church punched above its weight as it fought for civil rights in the city. The final stained glass panel erected by the congregation showed John the Baptist pointing to Dr. King preaching in Chicago in 1967. The two world wars had imprinted themselves on the congregation, first in the impetus to build the sanctuary, and then in the choice to imbue it with the stained glass of remembrance and hope. The war in Vietnam did not imprint itself on the congregation as much as strike and wound it. The divided opinions and multiple pains around the war resulted in a quiet but sure distrust that never left the congregation. As the 1980s and 90s came and went, the congregation's size hovered around 100 members. children of those who placed the stained glass still drove in from the suburbs, intent on having their own children involved. Yet, people slowly peeled off as the factories closed and the drug trade entered the neighborhood. And churches in the suburbs, or no church at all, seemed more logical and convenient. The congregation grayed. Now, there's no shame in graying. It's a part of life. It may be culturally uncomfortable, but it's nevertheless a sure sign that you're alive and that you've been living. St. John the Baptist was aging, but there was still life. Yet the church still had far less access to resources, and this concerned the denomination. In our case, it's Presbyterian or Methodist, Catholic, those are denominations. The congregation had always made but never exceeded its budget. Just enough new members arrived to offset the losses to funeral and long-term care centers. St. John the Baptist was as steady as the beams that the boys from the Great War had used to build the sanctuary, but the church's flat growth worried some. With no real sustainability plan, the church proposed hiring a new young pastor when the neighborhood began to shift in the 2000s, bringing in tech companies, restaurants, and single young adults. It was assumed that someone who could attract the new residents of the neighborhood was important, and it was. But something seemed to be amiss. From 2008 to 2017, the congregation had 3 pastors and 2 different names. A young church planter took over in 2008. I imagine his heart was in the right place, but I also know it's hard for young church planters to work inside existing structures. Inheriting a congregation with a 100-year history has its problems for those looking to move fast. I'm not completely sure what happened, but it appears he burned hot and then burned up. The congregation became known as Thrive. It littered the neighborhood with advertisements and used many of the new church growth and network building strategies. By 2011, the church planter was gone, moving on to a much bigger and boldly stated doctrinally orthodox congregation with multiple sites. It's hard to know, but reading between the lines, it seems that this young church planter, who was equally committed to correct doctrine and church growth, burned bridges within the congregation by the flames of his own ambition. In early 2012, a new young pastor took over. He seemed to stabilize things, keeping Thrive going, but perhaps not racing full throttle toward expansion or protection of pure doctrine. The new pastor's ambitions were not quite as high as the church planters. His goal was a growing church connected to the neighborhood, as opposed to, a multi-campus church that planted other churches. But in 2014, the tone of things seemed to change. Community organizing rather than church planting became the metaphor in focus. As the denomination entered debates around sexual identities and as social media galvanized people around identity issues across the country, Thrive at St. John the Baptist, or at least its pastor, weighed in. The congregation boldly positioned itself as a critical voice in the denomination, even taking a critical stance against the Christian tradition itself. This new young pastor even questioned whether the Christian church as a whole hadn't done more evil than good in the world. And he was now calling the church a community of post-Christians seeking to live right in this world, not for heaven. This focus seemed to fit the ethos of the neighborhood hand in glove. Whether it fit the congregation itself is hard to know, but the congregation's decline provided at least some justification for that not mattering. The congregation needed to be relevant in order to attract new people. To this pastor, nothing seemed more relevant than to critique the church and its tradition as a whole. Not surprisingly, when Thrive was renamed Thrive for Justice, few young people from the neighborhood participated. After the 2016 presidential election, the young pastor left the congregation and the Christian ministry, and one might assume Christianity, altogether. In the spring of 2017, the congregation welcomed its third pastor since 2008. Remaining were only a handful of members whose participation stretched back for decades. The congregation returned to just St. John the Baptist for its name, seeing no reason to retain Thrive. The congregation was now terminal, although it ignored the diagnosis until the fall of 2018. But I imagine you would have to have been in a coma not to feel it. All its life had been burned up in the ambitions and initiatives of the two previous pastors. No matter what this new pastor did, she couldn't revive it. By the summer of 2018, 15 people sat in a sanctuary built in 1920 for 100 and expanded to be for 200 in the 1950s. Again, 15 is no shame. A community of 15 people seeking the living Christ is beautiful. But what makes a congregation beautiful is its life, its vitality, not its numbers, programs, or access to resources. Its viability. A community that is alive is beautiful, whether 6 or 600. The problem was the lack of a pulse. These 15 people never interacted and rarely said much of anything to each other. The aura of lifelessness was so heavy that it felt suffocating. On Christmas Eve 2018, St. John the Baptist held its last service. Everyone knew it would be the last, and yet no one said much except the pastor. As the congregation concluded its final worship gathering, there was no visible emotion. People just disappeared into the cold winter night. It ended with no sign of life. It was just over. 8 weeks later, the corporate entity that was opening microbreweries across the Midwest took control of the building. That's the end of my quoting from Dr. Root. And let me just say, I know at least what the church people in my congregation will be thinking at this part of the sermon. Every pastor is thinking exactly the same thing they are. Every congregation, pretty much in the main line. Everyone who wants their church to live is thinking the same thing. And it goes something like this. Mike, it's all very well to talk about vitality, but honestly, when we hired you, we wanted more viability. We want more people sitting in those pews, singing hymns, serving on our committees, and putting money into the offering plate. Every congregation in the country has those same hopes when they call a new pastor. And believe me, every pastor really wants to accomplish those things, and we are really frustrated that we usually can't do it. We have two choices. We can blame ourselves as useless and incompetent pastors, or we can blame you. Church people are so stubborn, and they refuse to change when we come up with cool ideas like Thrive. The people in the pews probably have three choices. You can blame us idiot pastors. Why can't we get good pastors like we had in the old days? Or you can blame the people in the community who don't go to church anymore. Or you can go the low self-esteem route and blame yourselves. Andy Root has another option for all of us. We can blame God. Blame isn't quite the right word. We can call out to God. It still doesn't quite convey it. We can acknowledge the fact that the state of the church is mostly up to God. Andy puts it this way. The church cannot produce its own life. Nothing in creation can. Plants can't produce their own sunlight. Animals need other things for food. The church cannot produce its own life. The church is dependent on God for its life. God calls the church into being for God's own purposes. In life and in death, we belong to God. That is true for us as individuals. It is also true for us as churches. Sit with that while I go back to our Bible passages. What does Jesus tell us about our lives? I'm quoting from Luke. 15, I think. I tell you, do not worry about your life, says Jesus. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And what does Jesus tell us about churches? About the giant edifice in Jerusalem, Jesus said, I will tear it down and rebuild it in 3 days. What does Jesus show us about death? The people who crucified him thought death represented failure. He saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. Jesus knew better, no matter how painful it was. And believe me, the crucifixion was painful. The 3 days of his death and resurrection would bring redemption and new life. We could even say that it brought vitality. That is the good news of the gospel, the good news of Easter. The restoration of vitality to St. John the Baptist is what Andy Root is going to walk us through for the rest of the book. And it all starts with one small thing that happens at a funeral. Come back in 2 weeks to hear about that part. Thank you. God bless.